Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ya Ali Madad and Ramadan Mubarak. Welcome to this evening's discussion entitled Exalted Subjects, Studies in the Making of Race and Nation in Canada, which will be presented by Professor Sunaira Tobani. If you haven't heard of Professor Tobani before, you will no doubt be Googling her after you hear her speak. She is incredible. Her scholarship covers a wide range of topics, from critical race, feminist, and post-colonial theory, to globalization, Islam, and its depiction in Western media. Her most recent book is titled Contesting Islam, Constructing Race and Sexuality, which really challenges the way that we think about sexual and racial identity in the West and in Islam. But Professor Tobani is not just an ivory tower academic. She puts her scholarship into action. She was the president of Canada's National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and she is a founding member of Researchers and Academics of Color for Equity, RACE. So I am thrilled to have this incredible scholar and activist with us tonight to explore questions of national identity, Indigenous rights, citizenship, and migration, all with the view towards social justice. And this theme of social justice is one that I have been reflecting on a lot this Ramadan. After all, God tells us in the Holy Quran, "O humankind, be careful of your duty to your Lord, who created you from a single soul." And these words hold a deep spiritual insight about the nature of humanity, but they also contain a call to action. Muslims cannot stand by indifferent to the injustices borne by our fellow humans simply because they are different. Ramadan is a month of piety, but piety in Islam is more than just prayer. And piety also involves action to realize the social conscience of Islam. Professor Tobani's insights will give us all a lot to think about in this blessed month, and inshallah, will give us some inspiration to take action. So without further ado, I give you Professor Sunaira Tobani.
So thank you very much for inviting me to discuss my work and particularly my book, Exalted Subjects. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am on Indigenous territories here, on Coast Salish territories, and I work at a university that is located on Musqueam territory. So I want to, make this acknowledgement and also recognize that Indigenous peoples are involved in struggles for sovereignty, and the acknowledgement is also a statement of support for their struggles for sovereignty. So what I'd like to do is begin by describing how I became interested in the topics that I'm going to talk about today. So the two kind of topics that I'm going to talk about are how immigration is structured in Canada and also its relationship to citizenship and nation and state formation. So my interest in these topics began because I was working with a women's organization, and there was a review of the Canadian immigration program, and I participated in that review in consultations which were organized through the minister's office on behalf of this women's organization. And concurrently, there was also a review that was related to social security policy in Canada, so to do with social programs. So again, I was invited to participate in in that review as well for the women's group that I was working for. So I was really struck at how these two issues were treated as completely unconnected to each other. The immigration program was treated as discrete, as completely separate from social security. And social security, of course, is tied to the whole issue of citizenship and citizenship entitlements. And of course, so is immigration, because immigration actually allows access to citizenship. So it was very strange to me that the two sets of reviews didn't actually speak to each other. The other thing that struck me was the kind of stereotypes that were prevalent in the review processes, both in terms of the documents that had been prepared by the government for the review, and also in terms of the participation, the engagement of people who were participating in these reviews. So when I went to the immigration program review meetings, for example, it was quite common to think about and to talk about immigrants as all kind of wanting to take advantage of the immigration program, that immigrants want to jump the queue, that they come with big family, and so we have to pay a great deal of attention to family sponsorship and how that program is organized, and that immigrants come with big families, lots of dependents. So basically the discourse was that of immigrants who want to manipulate the system, take advantage of it, take advantage of the generosity of Canadians, and that the review should pay special attention to fairness, but also to make sure that people didn't take advantage of the program. So, these seem to be like classic racist stereotypes. Immigrants want to manipulate things, they want to take things that they're not entitled to. The nation is generous, but it still has to watch out for itself. So I found this very racist stereotypes kind of permeating the discussion. In terms of the social security review that was also taking place, there were also stereotypes there, but they were really positive stereotypes about how hard Canadians work, how social programs really need to be supporting them, that programs needed to be revised to make sure that the needs of Canadians are being made. So, the stereotypes that were emerging of Canadians were as hardworking, law-abiding, and that it was the job of these social programs to support them as best they could. So, there was such a kind of difference. And the stereotypes that I was hearing about Canadians was, of course, also racialized. There was an image of Canadians as nationals in this discourse, as responsible, paying taxes. So it was quite in very sharp contrast to the immigration review program. And I came to understand this discourse as one of whiteness, because Canadians were being imagined as white, and immigrants were all being kind of cast into this one category, which was clearly racially coded in terms of how the characteristics were being ascribed to people. So it seemed to me like, okay, how is this working? Because certainly, the stereotypes, people who want to manipulate the system, compared to those who are compassionate. Now, these speak to characteristics that we consider to be human characteristics. Everybody has these characteristics. Immigrants are also compassionate. Immigrants are also generous. Yet the language didn't stick to them. So anytime one intervened and said, well, immigrants also, make a contribution to Canadian society. They are compassionate. They're also humanitarian, law-abiding. It never quite stuck to the image of the immigrant that was being produced here. On the other hand, of course, not all Canadians are law-abiding. We know that. Many of them, commit crimes, all of that stuff. And yet this, pointing out those issues didn't stick to this idea of Canadian that was being constructed in these discussions. And of course, they would inform policy, and through policy, state practices in terms of how people are actually impacted and live their lives, what they have entitlement to, which family members can join them. So it seemed to me that these were really pretty crucial questions, and it was important to think through how these discourses were constructing them in very conflicting ways, and immigrants in particularly negative ways. The other thing that really struck me was that Indigenous people were not included in either review. And so, it seemed to me that, of course, immigration has a huge impact for Indigenous people. They've been dispossessed of their lands, they're fighting for sovereignty. So, the level of immigration, of course, has profound consequences for Indigenous people. Yet there was no space for Indigenous people in this review. And the same thing around social security, social programs, citizenship entitlements. These are issues of huge concern to Indigenous people. Yet there was just a sort of total erasure of Indigenous presence in these reviews. So anyway, this is how I started working on the project that actually led me to writing the book that I did, Exalted Subjects. So these issues, citizenship, immigration, rights, entitlements, Indigenous sovereignty, they organize Canadian society. They organize its forms of belonging, its forms of unbelonging. They also shape the relationship of the states to the various communities who live in these territories. And more important from my perspective, they also shape the relationships between these different communities. So, I began to unpack these characteristics that were being ascribed to immigrants and to Canadians and the erasure to Indigenous peoples. So I began to unpack them. So what does it mean to be compassionate? How does this get grounded? And, in terms of compassionate, of course, I was able to track that discourse of Canadians being compassionate is rooted in the welfare state. It emerges with the welfare state. And so I was able to historicize each one of these characteristics, law-abiding, compassionate, humanitarian, they emerge at particular moments in history, as do the stereotypes about immigrants. So this then kind of led me to develop a larger theoretical framework, is how do individuals come to be ascribed these particular characteristics, and then how do they internalize them? How do they come to own them? Because, there's no shortage of Canadian pronouncements of Canadian citizens, pronouncing themselves to be compassionate, humanitarian, tolerant. So how do they come to own them? How do they come to think that that is who they are as human beings? How does it give a structure to their humanity? And on the other hand, immigrants are on the defensive, right? You always have to prove that you're here legally, that you are not making claims that you're not entitled to. We're always put on the defensive. So, how does this shape our own experience, our relationship to, our communities? How do we see them? So I came to, call this a process of exaltation. And by this, what I mean is positive traits are actually attributed in state policy, in state practices, in state treatments of Canadians. And they construct Canadians as a particular kind of subject. The ideal Canadian then, of course, is compassionate, humanitarian. But what happens is that these exalted qualities become accessible to Canadians to claim for themselves. Not only do they claim them for themselves, but the state recognizes them as being that kind of subject. So the state makes available what I call, the subject position of goodness, of exaltation to Canadians. At the same time, then, the policing apparatus around, the policing mechanisms that are associated with immigrants constructs them in state policy, state practices, as interlopers, as intruders who have to be guarded against. They want what we have. They might not be entitled to it. And so we see this process on the one hand of exaltation and on the other hand of denigration. And so I saw how these were completely interlinked, and that immigrant itself is a racially coded term. So if immigrants become citizens, as most of us are, we still continue to be classified in state policy. We still continue to be treated as immigrants. That is the label that sticks to us. So immigrants then is a racially coded category. It doesn't actually speak to our legal status in the country. We might be citizens, but we still get constructed as immigrants, outsiders. So immigrant is a racially coded term. It racializes communities and it sets them apart. It sets them apart so that their belonging constantly has to be proved. Canadian is likewise, of course, a racially coded term. It speaks to the British and French origins of the nation. It speaks to the whiteness of British and French, of these British and French origins. So then this took me to a deeper level of wanting to understand how has this nation been formed so that we live out these relationships to the state, to each other in these particular forms of belonging, non-belonging in the present. So how has this nation been formed? And of course, Canada is a settler colonial society. It was founded through the colonization of indigenous peoples, through the genocide, the conquest, and the ongoing violence against indigenous people. So, it got me really interested in the idea of law, because of course this all took place legally in that historical period. The genocide of indigenous peoples was held up in law, conquest was held up in law, violence against indigenous people was upheld in law. So the kind of construct of Canadians as law-abiding hides this really violent history. So what do I mean? That the colonization of indigenous peoples was upheld in law. So the idea that allowed European empires to come in and colonize indigenous peoples in the Americas was the idea of terra nullius, which Europeans recognized in their laws. Terra nullius was the idea that the land is empty of people. And so Europeans had the right to come and take over the land, they discovered it. So we now understand this to be a completely racist construct. We also understand it to be an imposition of European laws, European understandings on indigenous peoples who were, in this framework, determined to be quote unquote primitive, quote unquote savages, lawless. Okay, and so when we talk about Canadians being law-abiding, this is the history that we're actually talking about. This is what grounds the idea, even today, of what the law is and what it means when Canadians claim to be law-abiding. Indigenous peoples, of course, were racialized as pre-modern, and the frame that the state used to treat Indigenous people is what has been called doomed to extinction, that these people had not evolved quite as much as Europeans had, and with the modernization, civilization of human societies, that pre-modern people were doomed to die out, basically, was the state approach to indigenous peoples until very, very recently. So indigenous peoples then become constructed as lawless. The systems, the norms, their forms of organizing society were declared to be lawless. Europeans refused to recognize them and instead constructed these societies as quote unquote primitive. So with the use of the law, indigenous people were dispossessed of their ancestral lands. They were pushed into reservations. The pass system was introduced. We also know how, the residential school system, which has received a lot of attention in the recent past, was introduced. The residential school system was introduced before Confederation, but it was upheld by the Indian Act of 1876. The residential school system was supposed to be a boarding school system to educate indigenous children. The purpose, however, as defined by the state, was, quote, to kill the Indian in the child. And so the residential school system was based on the premise that indigenous culture was, doomed to extinction, and that indigenous children should be educated into Canadian culture, they should be assimilated. The larger policy, of course, was to destroy the indigenous family and indigenous communities. The residential school system lasted over 100 years. The last of these residential schools were closed in the 1990s. So, the schools themselves, of course, we now have documented, many reports that they functioned largely as labor camps. Children were made to work in these camps. They were put to work. Widespread sexual abuse of children. And of course, the residential school system has had a devastating impact on indigenous peoples through the generations. The indigenous the residential school system also constructed indigenous people in the Canadian national imaginary as unworthy, as delinquent parents, unable to raise children, unable to educate them into a modern world. And, these stereotypes live with us today as well. where we now have the child welfare system that treats indigenous mothers as quote unquote bad mothers and takes away indigenous children from them. So this is, when we talk about the law and how it worked, well, this is what we're actually talking about. Of course, this doesn't get taught to us in our education system. It doesn't, children are not taught when you go through a Canadian education system, whether it's elementary, secondary, or even university. You don't get taught that this is actually what the law means in Canada. And this is, how we are thinking about national identity and national characteristics. So the governance of Indigenous people, of course, was set aside in the Indian Act, and it defined Indigenous people in racial terms, right? And so it was a racialized act that functioned in quite racialized ways and colonial ways. In fact, Indigenous scholars call the Indian Act a form of bureaucratized hatred. Indigenous women, of course, were particularly affected by this. And Indigenous women argue that the whole colonization process impacted Indigenous women by imposing a double patriarchy on them. So many Indigenous women have traced in their own history that pre-contact with the Europeans, women had very powerful positions in their communities. Women, were responsible for appointing chiefs, for example. So these are very powerful positions that women held. Many of these societies were matrilineal, if not matriarchal. Some were matriarchal. And so Indigenous women argue that through colonization and through this use of the law, a double patriarchy was imposed on them. First, the patriarchy of the Canadian state, and second, through introducing Canadian practices, Christian marriage, ideas about divorce, monogamous marriage, that they actually introduced patriarchy within Indigenous peoples themselves. And so the concept of double patriarchy is very important when we think about the struggles of Indigenous women today. Now, of course, Indigenous peoples turned the reservations from this kind of doomed to the site for their extinction into sites of survival. They contested state power. And of course, today, that is what we see, the Indigenous resurgence that has taken place now, and how Indigenous politics today have actually transformed national politics in Canada. And this is really the history behind, the long-lasting consequences of the colonization of Indigenous peoples. During the same period, of course, Europeans were being encouraged to migrate to Canada to settle the lands that were being taken away from Indigenous peoples. And of course, Europeans came to develop the economy, to settle the lands. They became integrated into the nation. And as part of this process, the presence of European women was considered to be very, very important by the Canadian state. So European women were recruited to come to Canada, find husbands here, marry, settle down here. And they were seen to be like the backbone of producing a new nation here, the Canadian nation. So, I'll just park that to the side when we think about gender, because Indigenous women were targeted by the same state as bad mothers, as not, doomed for extinction, targeted by specific policies, at the same time that we have this exaltation of European women as potential members of the Canadian nation, a valuable, a very, very valuable constituency in the development of this nation. But, this founding of this new nation, however, has a fundamental contradiction at its core. Because if you need labor, you need the land to be settled, you need a nation to be built, and you're bringing in Europeans to do that initially from Britain and France, you don't have enough labor. There wasn't enough migration coming in from European countries to actually develop the nation, particularly as a nation formation spread westwards. And so in terms of developing the economy, more labor was needed. And here, the state had to turn to workers from what we now call the third world. So, bringing in Chinese workers, for example, to build the railways in Canada. But the problem that the state faced was that bringing in workers from third world countries actually meant that these communities would settle here too, that they would be brought in under incredibly disadvantaged conditions, have no rights and entitlements in the same way that Europeans did, but they would come here and they would presumably reproduce and reproduce generations of what then were called non-preferred races. And so this was a kind of, a contradiction built into the very demands for labor, into the demand for development of the national economy, that there weren't enough white Europeans coming, and yet if you brought in people of color, then you're going to dilute the whiteness of the nation. And so this has remained a constant battle. It continues to be a major problem and a major issue in how immigration is organized today. So this fundamental contradiction to how to keep Canada a white man's country, which is how the project was officially defined, and yet how to bring in the labor that we need. And so again, here we see there was a particular targeting of women from the non-preferred races. The idea was that if you kept these women out of the country, if you allowed men to come in as temporary migrants, they wouldn't settle and they would go back as soon as the railways were built, for example, in the case of Chinese migrants. But of course, these people contested these racially discriminatory immigration policies. And, in the end, of course, there was an opening up of immigration program, but this idea that immigrants will come in and take over resources that rightfully belong to Canadians can be traced to these earliest immigration policies that constructed people of color as non-preferred races. This was the language of the immigration policy, the law, the state. So it's nothing that's hidden that we need to kind of, have some hesitation about discussing in such an overt way, because it was overtly racialized. Canadian nation formation has always been overtly racialized. And so we see how citizenship then comes to function as a mechanism that organizes a kind of triangulated formation of the Canadian nation state as a racial colonial formation. So Europeans can come, they are nationalized in their relation to the state as Canadians, they're exalted, they're seen as valuable members of the nation, their belonging not questioned, they have access to citizenship. On the other hand, indigenous peoples are colonized, marked for extinction, governed through the Indian Act without recourse to rights and entitlements in the same ways that Canadians do. And people of color are brought in as non-preferred races, as immigrants, constant outsiders whose presence here has to be defended, has to be proved. Now, of course, the people who came under this category of non-preferred races are, they come from very different histories. So Black people, for example, who came to Canada, many of them fleeing from the US since the 1600s, they were fleeing slavery. And so the conditions that Black people come under are very, very different from the conditions, for example, that Chinese Canadians come in under as migrant workers, and also South Asian. So the conditions are very different. We're racialized in very different ways. We have very unequal relationships to the state, unequal entitlements, but nevertheless, racialization continues to situate these communities in a hierarchy within Canadian society, and that determines our access to citizenship, to entitlements, to social forms of belonging. Now, of course, the Canadian nation state went through a period of reorganization in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I trace this in my book as well. Now, I don't want to go too far afield. I lay out the reasons for why I think these changes happened, but the long and short of it is that by the 1960s and 70s, we see that there's a period of liberalization of the Canadian state, its institutions. In the post-World War II period, of course, global economic expansion, huge increase in trade, requires labor. And of course, in the third world, the other change that's taken place is national independence. Many of these countries have now won national independence. So there are new opportunities that are opening up for Canadians for investment, for trade. And so the development of the economy becomes a very crucial factor, a very important factor. And what happens at this time is that, the immigration program changes. We have the introduction of the point system. So the point system is really important for us because most of the immigrants and large numbers of the Ismaili community, of course, come after this period of the liberalization of immigration policy. The point system, the state claims, is neutral, it's merit-based, it has no discrimination built into it. But of course, it's a highly discriminatory program because the immigration program in allocation of points, what is seen as neutral allocation, what we see is that the system becomes stacked in favor of those who speak English and French, for example. They get more points, those who have education, those who are professionals, those who have job offers, those who have family members here. How much wealth are they bringing into the country? What is their country of origin? So all of these factors work within the immigration system. And so to think of this as a neutral or merit-based system is a bit of a myth. Certainly there is some level of merit working here, but the larger program itself remains racialized because the program brings in people, and even if they are professionals, it still racializes them upon entry into the country. Immigrants you are, and immigrants you will remain. And of course, we've heard lots of stories of people from the third world, engineers, scientists, doctors coming in, and then their qualifications not being recognized, and they then fall into doing unskilled labor. So, immigration policy continues to remain racialized in many ways. The category immigrant itself, as I argued, is racialized. What we have, the point system does is it organizes the provision of labor to the economy. We have a very highly educated sector that comes in, but it also brings in large numbers of unskilled workers. And one way that it does that is through family sponsorship. So families, bring in family members who then don't have access to social entitlements because their sponsor is supposed to be responsible for them for a period of time. But during that period of time, most of them end up working, pay taxes. And so we see how citizenship, again, they become dispossessed through immigration policy from equal access to citizenship entitlement. And the immigration program is, of course, highly gendered because it's women and children who become dependents of the sponsor, who's usually treated as the male head of household. So again, we see this intersection of race, gender, class that was, very, very crucial to the earlier period of Canadian nation state formation. We see the same dynamics working again, but the language of race has gone. The language of race is no longer there. Allocation of points is seen as totally neutral, merit-based. So how does the language of race work during this period? At the same time that the Canadian point system is being introduced to organize immigration into the country, the Canadian state, of course, adopts official multiculturalism as its policy. Now, multiculturalism is really important for us because multiculturalism is celebrated today. Canada was a leader in this. Canada recognizes immigrant communities, recognizes that the country is diverse, and makes a commitment to, preserving the cultural heritage of all of these people. So I was really interested in saying, okay, what does multiculturalism do? Because multiculturalism, what it does is, of course, it allows Canadians to define themselves as tolerant, as plural, committed to pluralism, as committed to tolerance. So I then tracked multiculturalism. How does this come into being? How does this function? So multiculturalism is, of course, adopted in the early 70s by the Canadian government as official state policy. It is a recommendation of an earlier Royal Commission on bilingualism and biculturalism that was appointed in the 1960s. So what we see with the Royal Commission on bilingualism and biculturalism is that it defines the Canadian nation as bilingual, bicultural, so in terms of language and culture, whereas previously in the earlier phase, the British and French are defined as races. So now they become redefined, recoded language and culture. And the nation is considered officially British and French, but also there's a recommendation in the Royal Commission that there should be some kind of recognition of immigrants and the contribution that they have made to Canada. And so this becomes the basis for the official Multiculturalism Act. Supposedly, it recognizes the contributions of immigrants to Canada and celebrates their cultural heritage. But what does the policy actually do? What does it do for Canadians? And what does it do to people who are, and the communities who are defined as multicultural? So first of all, who is defined as multicultural? As soon as you unpack that, you realize you're talking about people of color. Who are we multicultural in relation to? How are we culturally different? And of course, we're culturally different in relation to bilingualism and biculturalism, i.e. British and French, i.e. Canadians, i.e. white. And so we see here what multiculturalism actually does is it protects the core of the nation as white in cultural and linguistic terms, bilingual, biculture. The rest of us then get lumped into multiculturalism. So the second thing that multiculturalism does is it fixes people of color to their culture, right? Their culture is seen as an essential trait, an essential characteristic. So our cultures are not defined as dynamic, changing, shifting, adapting. Instead, our cultures get defined as something that immigrants bring to this country. They live by them, and then they're associated with negative traits and with positive traits. Now, of course, this is a colonial definition of culture. The British, for example, legitimized their colonization of India by arguing that Indian culture was backward, it was traditional, women were treated horribly, and so the British were going to go in and civilize them. So this is the same idea of culture that we have here, that immigrants come from quote unquote traditional cultures, not modern cultures. And so they have to be celebrated. The good parts have to be celebrated. And so multiculturalism, even though it presents itself as a very benevolent kind of state response, state recognition, what we have is it actually racializes us through these long-standing colonial ideologies, and also fixes us to culture and racial inferiority. Multiculturalism, the third point, is also, it becomes the site from which the state recognizes people of color. So you have the whole multiculturalism bureaucracy, Canadian Heritage kind of functions there, and multiculturalism becomes the site where people of color can make demands on the state and be recognized, not in the site of politics, not in the site of social programs, for example, but in the site of culture is where the state will recognize our communities. And so multiculturalism becomes a policy of racial management. It reproduces the racial hierarchy. It produces the core of the nation as white. And also it continues to racialize people of color as culturally different, and sets in the process by which those communities that live by cultural traditions that are deemed to be good by the state can be recognized as model minorities. And those who live by cultural characteristics, practices that are described as bad by the state, they become the bad immigrants, right? They bring their arranged marriages here, they oppress women. We see a lot of this directed towards Muslim communities right now with Islamophobia. Islamic culture now is seen as deficient. Islamic culture promotes, it's pre-modern, it's fanatic, that it sanctions violence, it sanctions the oppression of women, it's hyper-patriarchal, it's hyper-homophobic. So this racializes all Muslims in the language of culture with a focus on Islamic culture. So then multiculturalism actually does the work of reproducing race without naming it as race, using a race-neutral language, but culture and language become coded with kind of racial assumptions, racial meanings. And so, I've been really interested in thinking through how this triangulated formation of the Canadian nation state, Indigenous peoples marked either for extinction or total assimilation now into Canadianness through the Truth and Reconciliation Project, immigrants, people of color who are always to be constructed as outsiders, yes, huge asymmetries of power between us, Black people, for example, seen as part of this kind of multicultural, people of color conglomeration. Anti-Black racism is really different from anti-Asian racism. And nevertheless, we get put into this kind of one pool, multicultural immigrants, which are all kind of categorizes categorizes all of us in racialized terms, and also reproduces this racial structure, not only between the nation, Canadian nationals and immigrants, but also between different communities of immigrants themselves, and the very asymmetric power relations that shape that hierarchy that's internal to the category people of color, internal to the category immigrants, internal to the category multicultural communities. And so I'm really, I've been really interested in my work to see how this kind of triangulated formation that one finds at the founding of the nation plays itself out. It played itself out in the 1970s when the liberalization of Canadian institutions take place, and now it's playing itself out in a particular kind of way with the war on terror, with the changes that have taken place as a result of that, and it's now being kind of re-articulated through the Islamophobic discourse where Muslims have been isolated even within this community of immigrants as particularly backward, particularly fanatic, and legitimizes the whole power structure, not only within the Canadian nation state, but also within the international order, within the international economy. So thank you very much. I'm glad to have had a chance to talk about my work with you, and I hope that you find these ideas interesting.
Thank you, Professor Thabani, for sharing your personal stories and your insights. You've given us a really powerful lens to understand the social, legal, and political context of Canadian history, as well as today's present situation. I also want to extend my thanks to all of you, our viewers, for taking the time to listen and learn with us. Wishing you all Ramadan Mubarak and Khuda Hafiz.